All right, so again, we're gonna real quickly recap a couple of things that we were talking about the other day. So if you remember, we talked a little bit about the neurotransmitters in your brain. What do the neurotransmitters do? Do you remember?
They send the signal.
Okay, they send this. They send the chemicals through the synapse that send the signals, right, of different things. And what are some of those chemicals? Do you remember any of those?
I want to say one was like an O, I think.
Orin?
I don't remember.
Like serotonin,
Yeah.
those kind of things. Remember those? Okay, so those chemicals go through the synapse, right? And so if you remember, there were a couple of different ways that they went through there. So there were the excretory, where it basically gives more, and there's the inhibitory. What the inhibitory does is it takes it back, basically. Okay? And so here's a couple of them that we were talking about that go through and what they do. Y'all remember that? Okay, and so we talked about the endorphins that give you the good mood, right? Those are the things that your body produces, like when you laugh, when you do things like that, and it gives you that good feeling, okay? And then we talked about, let me get there, let's skip a few. Okay, and one of the main ones that we talked about was serotonin. Okay, and we talked about what serotonin does and what happens when serotonin doesn't work very well. Okay, and one of the main things that happens when serotonin doesn't work very well is depression. And we kind of touched on that, but we didn't go in depth on that. Now, I know normally we don't go very in depth into some of the things, but I think in order to understand a little bit about how the brain works and how these chemicals in your brain work, we need to look at this a little bit more in depth. So that's what we're going to do today. So we're actually going to start, I just wanted to recap that, but we're going to start with a video that kind of explains the how the chemicals work, how the brain works when it's associated with depression.
You watching Amoeba Sisters?
No, we're not. We do in biology. We're not watching it here though. All right. Love commercials.
What did you think? Emotions are a critical part of the human experience. We laugh and we cry, but sometimes our emotions get out of hand. Sometimes the sadness we feel is common. It's actually the leading cause of disability among American adults. According to the National Institutes for Mental Health, in 2015, about 16 million people had at least one major depressive episode just during that year. That's almost 7% of the US population. Depression comes in many forms, but most of those forms have the same symptoms. They just vary in severity and length. Common symptoms of depression include sadness, feeling empty, hopeless, or worthless, fatigue, changes in sleeping patterns, irritability, changes in appetite, and thoughts of suicide. When a person experiences these symptoms for at least 2 weeks and it's interfering with their daily life, it's called major depressive disorder. This is the one you probably think of when you think of depression. But if those symptoms go on for more than 2 years, it's called persistent depressive disorder. And depression can be brought on by specific situations and life changes, like postpartum depression, which can occur after a person has a baby, and seasonal affective disorder, when the lack of sunlight in the fall and winter can trigger symptoms. Because depression can look like normal sadness, and because it's not always obvious what caused it, sometimes it's hard for people to believe that it's real. That's why some people argue that if you just try hard enough, you can break the cycle. You're in control of your own emotions, so you can choose to feel better. Anyone who suffered from depression knows that that's not true. We're still trying to figure out what causes it, and what exactly it does to our brains. And it's important for doctors and scientists to keep working at understanding the conditions so they can get patients back on their feet. There's definitely a genetic component to depression. If your parent or sibling has the condition, it's more likely that you might end up with it too. But it can also be linked to environmental factors. Things like abuse, neglect, and severe life stressors like financial instability or a death in the family all make it more likely that a person might develop depression. So, what's actually going on in your brain? Up until recently, scientists were pretty sure that depression was caused by an imbalance of certain chemicals within the brain. Dubbed the monoamine hypothesis of depression, this theory said that a lack of neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, two chemicals associated with feelings of pleasure and reward, would lead to depression. This theory is supported by a couple of things. First, scientists found that people with a particular genetic variation in the gene that codes for the serotonin receptor 5-HTT are more susceptible to depression after stressful life events when compared to people who don't have that mutation. This mutation is thought to reduce the production of serotonin receptors in the brain, leading to a decrease in serotonin signaling. There's also evidence, mostly from postmortem brains, that people with depression have changes in the dopamine signaling in their brains. Some research has found that in patients with a family history of depression, deliberately reducing levels of the proteins required to make neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine does decrease their mood. And finally, there's the fact that antidepressant medications like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, work. These medications function by altering the release of serotonin at the synapse, adjusting serotonin signaling throughout the brain. But scientists are no longer positive that depression is a direct result of a simple chemical imbalance. Some of the research and treatments have been inconsistent with that idea, and the condition is really complex. So researchers are also exploring a lot of other possible explanations. Brain imaging studies have found that patients with depression generally have less gray matter in several different brain regions, like the cingulate cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. Gray matter, made up mostly of neuronal cell bodies, dendrites, synapses, and glia, is the place where most neuronal signaling happens. So changes in gray matter volume can affect all kinds of things, like emotions, memory, and decision-making. This has led some scientists to theorize that depression is more related to structural differences than neurochemical ones. Basically, depression shrinks the parts of the brain that are important for controlling our emotions and making choices to take care of ourselves, making it hard for patients to recover from feelings of sadness. Some scientists think that depression could be related to changes in brain plasticity. That's the process that lets your neurons change and adapt their signaling in response to new information. It might even be related to a reduction in neurogenesis, the growth of new brain cells. Even though it's uncommon in the adult brain, there are some brain regions that create and connect new cells throughout our lives. This theory points out that chronic stress has a negative impact on neuroplasticity, and a similar change in neuroplasticity is seen in patients with depression. Treating the condition with antidepressants might increase the formation of new brain cells, and depressed patients taking antidepressants have higher levels of BDNF, a chemical that supports neurogenesis. Yet another theory about depression links it to our immune system. Research has found that patients with depression have unusually high levels of cytokines, small proteins that play a big role in the inflammatory response that kicks off when your body is responding to an injury. Cytokines are involved in sickness behavior. You know how when you're sick, you're usually not very hungry and have trouble concentrating and really just want to sleep a whole bunch? Hey, those symptoms sound an awful lot like depression, don't they? This theory proposes that high cytokine levels, caused by stress, can impact normal neurotransmitter signaling, leading to the symptoms of depression. This is why some doctors may encourage their patients to take anti-inflammatory medications like ibuprofen alongside an antidepressant. Therapy can be very effective at treating depression. About 1 in every 3 people will find that cognitive behavioral therapy alone can improve their symptoms. Micah is making a video all about the psychology of depression and how it's treated in a clinical setting. There are also a number of antidepressants available on the market. Medications like SSRIs, SNRIs, and tricyclic antidepressants function by increasing levels of neurotransmitters like serotonin and norepinephrine at the synapse. Monoamine oxidase inhibitors, or MAOIs, block the enzymes that break down those same neurotransmitters. In all cases, they're primarily aimed at enhancing neuronal signaling involving those neurotransmitters. But not every antidepressant Even different SSRIs can affect different people in different ways. And it takes a few weeks for the medications to really start having an effect. Sometimes it takes a while to find the right medication, which can be stressful and frustrating for a patient who's really needing help. Because depression is pretty common, and because it's complex, it could be that the underlying cause of depression varies from person to person. Whatever the cause, scientists are getting closer and closer to finding better solutions. And luckily, treatments do exist. They're not perfect, but they can definitely help. That's why it's so important to keep working on answering these questions, even when some medications are already available on the market. If you or a loved one has experienced depression, I hope that this video has helped you understand the condition a bit better. Please check out the description box below for resources on understanding and living with depression. Thanks for watching this episode of Neurotransmissions. If you liked it, hit that thumb.
All right. So hopefully that helps you a little bit kind of more understand the science behind that. And I use that because that's one of the more common ones. And there's a lot of, I guess, stigma attached to depression about it and what actually causes it and how people can deal with it and that kind of thing. So I just want to spend some time today just kind of talking through some of that. So here's some statistics for you, okay? As I said, it's one of the more common ones, but unlike some other diseases and or disabilities, depending on who you talk to, some may say depression is a disability, some may say depression is a disease. But either way, it's still basically the same, but you can't see it, okay? I mean, there's people walking around every day with depression and you may not know it. We tend to think that depression is one of those things that, you know, I call it the Eeyore complex, where they're walking around, woe is me, they're sad all day, they want to stay in bed, that kind of thing. But the fact of the matter is there's people every day, everywhere that you meet that are fully functioning people who suffer with depression. So a couple of statistics is right now there's approximately, this is as of like 2018, there's approximately 264 million people worldwide that have depression. About 40 million people in the United States, adults in the United States, so 18 or older, have depression. The problem is that only about half of them either know that they have depression and receive treatment for that. So think about that, okay? And the one that probably hits home to you the most is 1 in 4 people between the ages of 15 and 20 have depression. There's 17 of you in here. So think about that. That means at least, and we're not gonna say who has or who doesn't or who might or whatever, but that would mean that at least 4 of you have probably. That means at least 4 of you have dealt with it at some point, whether you really know it or admit it or not. Okay? And so again, that's another reason why I thought it was important to kind of talk about this while we were on the science behind it. Because it can affect you. If it doesn't affect you directly, it could affect your friends, your family. Somebody in your life is probably going to be either dealing with it or will deal with it soon. And so that's why I wanted to talk to you about this. So, if you remember, was everybody here the day I spoke in chapel? Yes, y'all remember that?
Wait, when
Okay.
was that?
It was back at the beginning of the year.
I don't remember.
Anyway, okay. Well, if you remember, when I spoke in chapel, I was talking about some of the struggles that I went through dealing with stress, dealing with different things. What I did not mention at the time is that one of the things that I've been dealing with for the past 2 years is depression. I was diagnosed with depression a little over 2 years ago. I'm sure I had it much longer than that, because looking back now, I can see the symptoms and when they came up a lot more. But being the stubborn person and the perfectionist that I am, that brought on a lot of stress, I kept putting it back and putting it back. And, you know, in depression, as they said in the video, depression, different people deal with it in different ways, and it affects different people in different ways, okay? You know, I was still, you know, even from the time that I was diagnosed, even now, most of the time when I tell people that I have depression, they don't believe me, because most people would never think, because, you know, of how I act on a regular basis. But what they don't see is how I act when nobody's around. And that's the hardest part. And so, you know, there were times, even, you know, days at school here, that it was all I could do to function and to teach and to do the things that I had to do on a regular basis. Like, I was struggling. I really had to push myself in order to do that. I mean, even just to get up in the morning, to get out of bed and drive to work was, on some days, was a struggle. No, obviously some days are better than others. And so, when, you know, the symptoms of depression can manifest themselves different ways with different people. One of the main ways that mine manifested, that it finally, you know, came out and almost forced me to seek help, was through anger. There was a situation that happened that I really let my anger get to me. And to be honest, it was scary for me to be in that. And so it was then that I realized something was wrong and that I needed help. And so I reached out to a friend of mine and got the help that I needed. I within probably, 2 weeks after the incident happened, I started going to counseling. That was the cognitive behavior therapy they were talking about. You know, there's different forms of that. Mine was just basically going to a counselor, you know, someone you talk through things. And it was within a couple of visits of going to her that she was the one that diagnosed me with that. And so, you know, we began working through that. And it's a huge process. And I mean, even 2 years later, I'm still going and we're still working through things, because all through the process, the thing that I didn't realize is, like, all of the stuff that I was stuffing down inside, you know, y'all ever done that? Like, you're just like, oh, I'll deal with that later. But the thing is when you have depression, a lot of times you're doing that and you don't realize you're doing it, and you don't realize the things you're stuffing down. And so I had stuffed down so much stuff over the years that I didn't even realize was there. This just now coming out. I mean, things that happened like when I was a kid, and things that happened when I was your age, and things that happened when I was in college, and things that happened, you know, 10 years ago. And all throughout, all these things are coming up, and I'm like, whoa, where did that come from? Well, it's because of depression, you know, because a lot of those days I was in a fog and I couldn't deal with things, so I just stuffed them down and then I forget about them. And that's what depression does, at least did to me, and what it does to a lot of people is it causes you to do those kind of things. And so that's why it's important to you know, if you're having some of those symptoms or some of those thoughts or some of those feelings, to seek help. And that's why, you know, when I talked in chapel at the beginning of the year, that's why I talked about how important it is to learn how to deal with your stress and learn how to deal with those things that cause you stress. Because, you know, one of the things she mentioned in the video is that one of the theories that they think is, like, if you have a really stressful time in your life, and how many of you are having really stressful times in your life right now, trying to get into college, trying to get the proper roommate, trying to make the good grade so you can be higher, you know, class rank and all that stuff. I mean, you know, that's a stressful time, right? And you need to learn how to deal with that properly, so it doesn't, you know, because it could lead to other things. And so again, that's one reason why I wanted to talk about it. And you know, there's so much stigma attached to depression. Y'all know what I mean when I say stigma, right? So there's so much stigma attached to it. So I actually have my pen on today. So this green ribbon, it says end the stigma, okay? And green is the color for mental health awareness. And May is actually Mental Health Awareness Month, but not that you need to know that. But one of the things is, you know, I grew up in a time and in a place where everyone thought that the reason why someone got depressed was because they had unconfessed or uncontrolled sin in their life. They thought, and I was taught, that it was because of sin. It was because of something that you had done. Okay? And so for that reason, you didn't really talk about it. Nobody ever mentioned it. Nobody ever said anything about it. Nobody ever, you know, it wasn't talked about. And so it was really hard for me, you know, when my counselor was like, you know, I really believe you have depression. I mean, my first thought was, okay, then what have I done? You know, I know the science behind it, but my first thought was, okay, what have I done? What do I need to confess? What's going on? And she and I had to really work through that and really work through trying to get rid of that stigma that I had. Even though I knew that that wasn't the case, it was just the way that I was raised and the way that, you know, that I was taught that that's what it was. And, you know, and you didn't talk about those things, and you didn't talk about feelings, and, you know, it was kind of like, well, just get over it and go on kind of thing. Okay, that's the way I was raised, you know. That's the whole saying, you know, put some dirt on it and go on. I mean, that was my life as a kid. That was how, you know, and I'm not saying anything bad that's wrong, but, you know, that stigma was attached to that, and so we didn't talk about it. And so that was one of the one big struggles from the beginning that I had to get over, was unattaching that stigma. And I had to be like, you know what, it's okay, because depression, because it's caused by chemical imbalance or caused by something in the brain, like I said, it's a disease like anything else. And, you know, like diabetes, you can't control if you get diabetes, right? You can't control if you get, you know, if you get a toothache. You can't control if, sorry. You can't control if you get a cold. You can't control if you get the flu. I mean, there's even people, yes, you can get vaccines for the flu, but I've heard of people who get the vaccine and still get the flu, right? So you can't control those things, and depression's the same way. You can't control it. And on that same side, if someone has depression, let me tell you, the worst thing you can tell somebody if they have depression is, oh, just get over it. Or, oh, well, just think good thoughts. Or, oh, just don't think about that. You know what? It's not that simple. If it was, believe me, things would be a lot better. But it's not that simple. And so, you know, I went to counseling for, like I said, I'm actually still going now over 2 years later. Obviously not as regular now as I was before. But, you know, one of the things that, it was probably about 6 or 8 months in to that the idea of medication came up. And I was like, I ain't doing that. You know, again, kind of that stigma in the back of my head. I ain't going there. I don't need that. I can deal with this on my own. Okay, that's my control freakness, and that's my perfectionist, and that's my, you know, I can do this on my stubbornness, if I can do this on my own. So it was probably almost a year later after that I finally got to the point to where I can't do this. I got to do something. And my counselor finally convinced me, hey, you need to go talk to your doctor, and you need to see about getting on medication. So, long story short here, it was, I think I went in October of this year, so only a few months ago, and got on medication. And let me just tell you, about 2 weeks, because, you know, it does take a while to actually start working. About 2 weeks after being on medication, I woke up one morning and I sat up in bed and I was like, I feel normal. And it was the best feeling in the world, because here I had been going 2-3 years of not feeling like myself, and feeling like something was wrong, and feeling like I had to push myself, and feeling like I couldn't do the things that I wanted to do, and things that one of the main things is, one of the main signs of depression is like when you start not wanting to do the things that you love. And there were things that I didn't want to do anymore, things that I had loved for 10, 15, 20 years, and I didn't want to do them anymore. And I just woke up that one morning and I'm like, dude, I feel normal. I feel like I want to do these things. I feel like I want to, I want to go do this and I want to go do that. And it was great. And then about halfway through that day, that feeling kept going, and about halfway through that day I was like, dude, why didn't I do this sooner? Why was I so stubborn? Here it has been, we've been talking about this for a year, about getting on medication. Well, why was I so stupid? And so, that's one of those things, again, that was because of that stigma attached to it. So if, going back to my analogy, like if you had diabetes and you needed insulin, and I think that's what finally convinced me, is I either saw it written somewhere or somebody told me, be like, you know what, if you were a diabetic and you needed insulin, you'd go on insulin and give, so you could live, right? Well, what's the difference? It's what you need in order to function properly. And believe me, up until then, I was, some days I don't think I was functioning at all. It was basically going through the motions. And there's some days I could get home and I couldn't tell you anything I did that day, because I didn't remember, because it was just basically going through the motions. And so now, like I said, I've been on medication and that since about October, the first part of October. And, I feel like a totally different person. I feel like myself again. Relationships across the board with friends, family, whatever, has gotten better. Just everything is just coming together, and everything's starting to make sense, and everything's starting to get back to where I really think that it's supposed to be, And I say all that not to say that, that I'm a great person for doing that or whatever, God was in this all along. He was using this, he was showing me things, and, I'm a firm believer that your struggles and the things that you go through, that God has a purpose for those. Does he do it to you? No, not necessarily, but I do believe that, he wires us the way he wires us. So, with me having depression, I don't think it was a punishment, but I think God did it for a reason. I think, that's the way he made me, and that's okay. He makes us all unique. There's something different about all of us, and something different that we all struggle with. But I'm a firm believer in that he will use those struggles and he will use those difficulties in our life for a number of reasons, to help us learn something and come closer to him, but also to help others. And so I can't tell you, it would take me all week to sit here and list all of the things that I've learned about myself or about God through these last 2 years and everything that I've been through. But one of the main things that I know that he wants me to do, that is another reason why I'm sharing with you today, is that he wants me to use this to help others. And obviously I have a passion for teenagers and I have a passion for students, and so I wanted to share this with you as a personal experience to maybe help you if you think you might be, or you're not sure, or you do in the future, or someone who is. It's important that even if we have those stigmas about how bad it is, or that it's not supposed to be that way or whatever, it's important to seek help. And one of the things I believe is that, one of the things that can help you most is seeking help from people who know what you're going through, right? It's really hard one of the things I found through this, it's really hard with depression to talk to people about it who's never been through it, because you can't describe it. And so some of the best relationships and the best friends that I've made, the closest friends that I've made in the last 2 years, are either someone who is going through it themselves or someone who has a family member who is going through it. Because we have that relationship. We can talk to each other about it. We can we can talk about what's going on, talk about, how to deal with this and how to deal with that. And we can bounce things and ideas off of each other. And so, so that's kind of where I'm at now. So I just want to encourage you, if you think you might be, or you're pretty sure you are, or you're not sure, struggling with it, I encourage you to talk to somebody. I mean, I'm here, my door's always open. Obviously, I'm not going to judge you because I totally understand where you're coming from. If you think somebody else is and you're not sure maybe how to approach them or how to talk to them, I encourage you to seek out help in doing that. Again, I'm here for you if you need to talk or anything like that. You can come in, whenever. If I'm here, I would be more than happy to talk to you, or whatever. So I just wanted to share that with you today. And before we move on, I just wanted to just kind of open it up if anybody has any questions about me personally, about depression, about anything like that, or comments or anything that you want to say, ask, whatever. Just want to give you a chance to do that because I know it's kind of a heavy topic and it might be one you have on your mind that you've thought about and you're not really sure or whatever. So, anybody? Nobody? I know you're thinking, so I'll give you a second to process. Does anybody have any questions or anything they want to say about it, or? Okay. Yes. Unrelated questions are okay too. Anybody? Yes.
I have advice. Don't downplay counseling. It's actually very, very helpful.
It is very, and I would think that counseling is even good even if you're not going through something like depression. I mean, especially at your age right now, you're getting ready to make this huge transition. And how many of you are stressed out about something to do with that transition? Anything. Whether it be where you're going to live, how you're going to pay for it, who your roommate's going to be, what school you're going to go to, how much money they're going to give you, anything to do with that transition. You're about to go through this huge transition, okay? Counseling, just talking to someone really helps you deal with that stress, right? If you've dealt with, just different things, a loss of a loved one, stress, depression, anxiety, anything like that, it's really good to talk to somebody. Even if it's just one time, a trained counselor can do amazing things. Like I've told my counselor, I don't know how many times, there's no way I could have done this without you. And then I keep thinking in the back of my mind, one of these days I'm not going to have her anymore and it's going to kill me. I'll be like, I need to find somebody, right? I almost keep making things that I really don't, but sometimes I tell her I'm going to start making things up because when she starts talking about, well, maybe you don't need to come see me for a while, I'm going to tell her I'm going to start making things up so I can just come, just because I just like talking. I don't get to talk to adults and have this conversation and talk about myself on a regular basis. So yes, good point, good advice. Anybody else?
Wait, I have a question.
Yes.
What were you depressed about?
Well, see, that's the thing with depression is that normally it's not just one in particular thing. It can be a lot of different things. And so most of the time you can't really pinpoint it.
Did you just get down really easy?
Yeah, it's mine, what I'm learning, and again, this is one of those things that I'm still learning, is that one of the things that I'm learning about myself is, I'm gonna use this term, I don't know if you guys know what it means, if you don't, I can explain it. I'm a people pleaser, do you know what that means? Okay, so, basically, I want to try to please everybody. And you know, that's not possible, right? And so, my thing is I'm really hard on myself when I can't do that. I've been really hard on myself when I can't do that. So, obviously, when I can't please everybody, my train of thought, and that's one of the things about depression is you have to learn to change your thoughts as well, is my train of thought has been, okay, well, this person isn't 100% pleased with this outcome, so therefore I'm a failure. I mean, literally, that was, and thankfully I've learned to change that, but that was my train of thought for the longest time. Well, obviously, if that's your constant thought, and you're constantly thinking about negative things and about how you didn't do something right, or how you let somebody down, or how you're not good enough, that was my big thing, is I kept telling myself I wasn't good enough. Well, that's eventually going to weigh on you, right? And so that's really where a lot of that came from, and a lot of that depression came from, was that constant feeling and that constant telling of myself of not being good enough. And so it took me a long time to get rid of that thought and to learn to change my thoughts into, you know what, I may not have pleased them, and that's okay, but there's only one person I need to please, and that's God. And as long as I stay obedient to Him, it really doesn't matter what everybody else thinks.
How does it counseling help?
Well, they just, so, going to counseling, you know, you're basically talking to someone, and you can talk about your feelings and things that you're dealing with, and they can actually help you find tools on, like, one of my things was changing my thinking, so they can really help you with that, with tools. And sometimes I had a really hard time of saying, you know, this is how I'm feeling. I don't know why I'm feeling this way, but this is what I'm feeling. And so she would just kind of help me. She had a very unique way of thinking through, helping me think through those feelings and trying to figure out, okay, where's that coming from? Why am I feeling that way? And how can I adjust those things. And so, because a lot of times, if it's your feeling, you know, you want to hold on to it, and your perspective is one-sided. Does that make sense? Like, you're only seeing one side of that. You're seeing how you feel, and you can't see those other things around you that may be causing you to feel that way. And so that's where a good counselor will say, okay, well, let's dig into this. And, you know, they can either ask you questions or kind of lead your thinking and your conversation into a way where you can figure out, okay, if I'm angry, you know, but I can't pinpoint why I'm angry, then what made, you know, let's talk about how you felt when you started feeling that way, and kind of what led up to that, to try to figure out what made you angry, and how can we, in the future, how can we deal with those things to come and maybe help avoid that in the future. Does that make sense? Okay. Anything else? Yes.
Did you ever have suicidal thoughts?
Good question. Okay. So a lot of people who have depression do, and I won't get into the whole discussion about suicide or whatever, but I in particular never really had any thoughts of I'm going to kill myself. However, I did have thoughts of kind of like, well, what would it be like if I wasn't here? Or, you know, maybe I should just get like really, really sick and be in the hospital so people will come and see me and think that I'm like, you know. So, does that make sense? Like, not necessarily like, yeah, so not really thoughts of, you know, I don't want to be here anymore, you know, I'm going to take my own life kind of thing, and again, I'm not downplaying that, but more of, I guess, just thoughts of, yeah, you know, if I get really, really sick and I have to go in the hospital, then, you know, and then all of a sudden I miraculously get healed, well, then people are gonna be like, oh, well, you know, she's this great person because she had this, you know, disease or whatever, and now she's healed, and, you know, look at her faith and all this kind of stuff. So mine were kind of geared more toward that rather than actual suicidal thoughts. Anything else?
I know this was like a sad topic, but this
That's
is
fine.
actually like pretty cool. No, like just the whole
Yeah,
brain thing
yeah.
is pretty cool.
Yeah.
It's funny how that works.
Yeah,
It makes
well, and that's the
sense.
thing, like I said at the beginning, you know, this is one of those things that we hear about on a regular basis. I mean, you know, people, you know, people committing suicide, and most of the time people who commit suicide have depression. I'm not saying all of them, but most of them do, you know, going back to, you know, Robin Williams and some of the more, you know, famous ones. But we hear about it on a regular basis, but we don't really think about, you know, we're just like, oh, they had depression, and then we move on. We don't really think about what the science is behind it, and then usually it's like them, like that person, we don't, it's not, you know, it's not more on a personal level, you know? So, like I said, you know, there's probably people in this room right now, you know, besides me, who have dealt with it in some shape, form, or fashion, and so, you know, I think it's important, one, that we make it personal to us, and that's why I wanted to share, because yes, I'm dealing with it. But I also think it's important for us to understand the science behind it, because if you don't, then it's just like, oh, okay,
He's gonna move.
yeah.
Yeah, there's this guy, I'm just kind of random, but, there was this thing I saw, it was like on Sports Center, and there was this brother that played at South Carolina. Well, he had another brother, and they're both quarterbacks. One of them, the other one's playing at Washington State, and he, you know, he played football. He started there, and you know, those football players, you know, they get head traumas and stuff. Well,
Yeah, I remember that, I know those brothers, I don't know
Last
them
name is like-
personally, but I know their stories.
starts with an H. And
Oh,
Zelensky.
Zelensky, yeah, Zelensky.
it was so bad that he committed suicide. And it was like a mix of probably his depression and this thing called like ECO or something.
Mhm.
It's like a head trauma, and you don't know it.
Yeah,
And he was a happy person, but inside he kept it in.
Yeah.
And they found him dead like, in his apartment.
yeah,
And like his mom and dad still have hope and kind of, you know, still carrying on his legacy to tell athletes and to go on campus and talk to them about how serious it is for you to know if you know, if it's, you know, you don't know if it's a really concussion, you know, it could be
Right.
something really bad that can be there for years. You don't even know it.
yeah. Well, and like you said, the thought of a happy person, I mean, think of Robin Williams. How many of you have ever seen Robin Williams' movies? He's a hilarious
Yeah.
guy, you know? And then, like, when he committed suicide, everybody was like, what's he got to worry about? You know? But what they didn't know is that behind the scenes, he was dealing with severe, severe depression. And here's the thing, you know, everybody, you know, especially like recently, I don't know if you know, but there was a semi-famous pastor in California who, in the late spring, early fall, somewhere in there, committed suicide because he had been dealing with depression for a long time. And he and his wife actually started a ministry to help those that were dealing with depression. And everybody's like, how could a pastor who is helping people with mental illness commit suicide? Well, that's what I was thinking about, that's what I was saying earlier, is with depression, a lot of those things happen and you don't even realize that they're happening. You know, it's almost like a whole nother world. You know, sometimes you're like normal and you can, you know, you have normal thoughts and stuff, but sometimes, like I said, there were days I went home, I couldn't tell you what happened that day. You know, 5 minutes later, I couldn't tell you what happened 5 minutes earlier. So, you know, I say that to say, you know, don't judge people, you know, in that. And I don't think any of you would have a problem doing that. But, you know, of course, suicide's a whole other topic that we could get into and take the whole day on, but we won't do that. But, you know, yes, it happens. And, you know, no, I don't think you know, me personally, I'm not trying to convince you of anything, but a lot of people say that, you know, suicide is like an unpardonable sin, and because you commit suicide and you can't ask for forgiveness afterwards, like most sins, that if you commit suicide, you're gonna go to hell. Well, no, I don't think that's true. And one of the main reasons I don't think that's true is because if you read in scripture, it says once saved, always saved. It doesn't matter what the sin is, you're gonna go to heaven, okay? And I'm sure we could all sit here and think of things that we've done that we haven't confessed for, and there's gonna be things on your deathbed that, you know, that you haven't confessed of. And does that mean that God's not gonna bring you into heaven just because there's one thing that you did that was wrong? No, okay? So, you know, again, that's just my feeling. Whatever you believe is your belief, but I don't think if you commit suicide, you're gonna go to hell necessarily. I think that, you know, if you've truly accepted Christ, that He will forgive you. Will He be disappointed? Of course. But I don't think He's going to banish you to hell for that. So, anyway,
Yeah,
sorry,
I
total side
I
note.
feel like football players, like athletes, they have a tough time because, you know, how many hits they get.
Yeah, and they definitely are more susceptible. And as we talk today, and as we talk more, and we talk about brain injury and brain damage in the brain cells, some of that stuff is going to come up. So if you remember in the video, they talked about the different areas of the brain that they can see are affected by it. Well, think about it. If you're a football player and you're constantly taking these hard hits, that's going to affect your brain, okay? You know, they've even done research on football players who have passed away from brain injury, trying to figure out exactly how multiple concussions affects the brain. And so many football players now, you know, after they get a couple of concussions, they're retiring early because they don't want to get to that point. Because it does, and we're actually, one of the things we're going to talk about either today if we get to it, or on Wednesday or Friday, is about how that impacts and how those concussions affect the brain and what that's like. So yeah, they're definitely more susceptible to that because of that brain injury and because of the changes in brain matter. All right, anything else?
That, go ahead.
How would, like, from somebody who doesn't have, like, depression, how do you detect it in somebody else if it's not always obvious?
Well, that's a good question, because it's one of those things that is hard, because most people who have depression, like me, are gonna try to hide it from everybody else. And so, there are gonna be subtle signs, and I'll talk about those, but yeah, it's gonna be very, very hard, because most people are gonna try to hide it from everybody else and not let people know it. And like my hardest part was at night when I was at home by myself, or not necessarily by myself, but just kind of in my own little world and nobody else was around, and that was the toughest time. A couple of things that you can just look out for. One is mainly look out for like constant mood changes. Okay, now obviously people have mood changes, but there's a difference. So if they're constantly going from happy-go-lucky to then all of a sudden being like really angry or really upset, that could be a sign. If they're sleeping more than usual, that's a big one, because most people that have depression don't want to get out of bed. Or yeah, I'm not saying like you're tired. There's a huge, I'm not saying like every once in a while you get more sleep. I'm saying like a constant thing, like I just don't want to get out of bed, you know. Another thing you can probably look for is like they might start saying certain things just kind of in their speech, like I don't feel like doing this, or I don't want to do this, or you know, especially if it's something that they used to enjoy. Like, you know, if you had a friend that you like to go to a certain restaurant with like once a week, and then all of a sudden they're like, you know what, I don't want to do that anymore. Or if you make plans with them and they cancel at the last minute but don't really have a really good excuse, that's a big sign. And another thing is just kind of watch them as they either interact with you or interact with a group of people. Is a lot of times, maybe especially if they were more social before, now they're going to kind of be a little bit more reserved. Now, if they're more reserved, that doesn't necessarily mean anything, because some people are introverts. Okay, that was part of my issue too, because I was an introvert and I had depression, and that just, you know, An introvert means you just don't like being around people. Gotta figure that one out. In a social setting, okay? But yeah, so just watch for changes. I mean, that's the big thing of anything, is just watch for changes. And if you see something, just maybe, if you see something that might be, maybe all of a sudden they just get really, really upset over something that really they shouldn't get upset over, is just, maybe not right then, but maybe later when they settle down, just be like, one of the main questions you can ask somebody who you think might have it is just, not, because you don't want to put them on the offense, because if you put them on the offense, that's bad. So just maybe be like, hey, how are you? How are you feeling? That kind of thing. What's going on? And those kind of things, just general terms like that, and get some information. And if they're kind of like, well, maybe then try to get it out of them. But I mean, yeah, it's really hard to, because like I said, it does different people different ways, so it's really hard to pinpoint certain things. But basically, just look for changes in their behavior. Anything else?
That medicine, does it I caught bits and pieces. It doesn't actually send those, what was the two things you needed? Dopamine?
The serotonin and dopamine?
It doesn't actually send those to your brain. It does
No,
like
so
alter
what, SSRIs is the most common one, and the one like we put in the PowerPoint, Zoloft, okay, that's what I'm on, okay? Basically, so it's an SSRI, which is, serotonin reuptake inhibitor, okay?
Okay.
So basically what happens, if you remember in the nerve impulse, it sends the serotonin out of one nerve into the other. Well, sometimes what happens is that serotonin will kind of backtrack, and it will want to, what we call reuptake into the nerve ending that it just came out of. So it wants to kind of go backwards. And so what the reuptake inhibitors do, the SSRIs, is they basically close that uptake gate out so the serotonin can't come back. So the only option it has is to continue down the nerve impulse. So it's kind of like your brain is making enough serotonin, but it's just not completing the process. So that's closing off those gates so it continues and it doesn't come backwards.
Does that affect you in any other way?
I mean, there's some other side effects that you can have, but Zoloft is one of the ones that it doesn't have a lot of adverse side effects, meaning that there's not a lot of things, that it's going to affect. So most of the time, no, they're not going to affect you in different ways. Now, some of the other ones might. I'm not as familiar with those, but for the most part, they're not going to have some huge effect on you. Yeah.
Yeah, I have it.
Yeah, I mean, just like
Pretty cool.
any other drug, there's side effects to them, but most of them aren't anything like humongous, like the ones you hear, may cause, liver, all this stuff, and possibly death. I mean, I guess it's possible, but for the most part, they're not, they're not that bad. Anything else?
Yeah.
What were those other types of medication?
There's a
SSRI.
SSRO, I'll have to look it up, SSRO and then triglycerides or something like that. I'll write it down for you. Is that what you want? You just want to know what they are?
Yeah, I just want to know the difference.
Okay, yeah. Well, I'll look into that. Like I said, I'm not as familiar with it. I've heard of them, but I don't know exactly what they do. So I can look that up while you are watching the other videos. So, all right. So we'll close that off again. If you want to come talk to me more, about my personal experience, or maybe you think you might be dealing with some symptoms, or somebody else, and you want to come talk to me personally, my door's always open, and I would love to talk to you about that. Okay. So